Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mario Pichardo. In today's episode, we are going to be continuing on where we left off last time, talking about MGTOW, talking about kind of the men's rights movement as it pertains to what we were talking about in terms of the gender roles as they evolved from the 40s, 30s, 50s onward, all the way up to today, and how, the kind of perceptions of what a man and a woman is have changed. But specifically with regard to where that's left men. So if we go back, we can kind of see that yes, as women have gained, the right to vote, women have gained all of these powers. Women have been, told that they should be more independent, that they should be all of these things. It's really created kind of a division between men and women in terms of if we look at, like, say, marriage rates, for example, our divorce rates are at an all-time high. If we look at criminal justice cases, for where men win, say, custody of the kid, the chances of a man winning custody are abysmally low today, compared to what they've ever been. And so, we see kind of a heavy slant towards a woman's perspective or a woman's interests. And so, if we have a case like, for example, there was a case that actually happened fairly recently, where there was a man who, stops to help a woman at the side of a road. Well, he stops, he helps her. Her car broke. I don't know if she had a flat tire. There was something to that effect. So the man stops side of the road, a couple hours, he helps her out. Well, and then he leaves, he goes on his way to go back home. He says that, he always believed, whenever something happened, he was supposed to stop and help. That's just the kind of person that he was. And what ends up happening is that the woman ends up going to the police and telling them that, hey, this man, he sexually assaulted me. And so, the cops go and they find this guy, and he denies the accusations that, it didn't happen. They take him anyway. They put him in jail. And there the guy sits and he gets incarcerated, and he gets, this is like his life now, based on these alleged charges. And, the guy says, and he says, this destroyed my marriage. This destroyed my relationship with my kids. This event having happened. And what ends up happening is that someone eventually finds the video proving that this man is innocent. It proves that this man did not sexually assault this woman. The woman, I believe, later comes out and says, oh yeah, it didn't really happen. Was kind of just saying it. And so, this man has his life destroyed as a result of what a woman just kind of claims that he did. And it goes on to, kind of point out a real issue in our society with respect to how men are really perceived, how men are treated. And, there's a movie that actually talks, it's a documentary, talks a lot about this type of issue. It's called The Red Pill. And it discusses, men's rights in light of a lot of these kinds of stories where there are men who, get accused of things and the cops come right to the house and they arrest him. Where the wife threatens the man, she says, if you don't do what I tell you, I'll tell the cops you beat me. And she starts hitting herself. She'll just say, and she says, I'll just tell them that you hit me and you'll go to jail and I don't care. You know what I mean? And so, for a lot of men, something called MGTOW has come into the limelight for them. And MGTOW, for those who don't know, stands for men going their own way. And it has come into prominence as a result of men being fed up with how the court system is heavily weighted against men. The court of public opinion has been pushed in favor of egalitarianism. And as a side effect of that, the value of a male has been suppressed. Well, not because of that, really, as a result of third wave feminism. Uh, and so now we kind of have a society where men are really told that they're useless and they're worthless in society. And for those who haven't seen, the red pill really kind of espouses on that idea and explains how and where it happens. You know, men don't have homeless shelters to go to. They don't have counseling places or services that they can just go to and kind of share and explain their story, where they can just wash up. There's a disproportionate number of women and children's shelters compared to men's. And it goes on to just say, you know, men almost never get the custody of the children. Men almost always have to pay some form of child support or alimony. Even in one case where the child was genetically proven not to have been the father, the court ruled that he still has to pay alimony, or he still has to pay child support. And so, you know, in light of Me Too, which has only exacerbated the problem, we can look at, say, the Kavanaugh hearing where Christine Blasey Ford, I believe is her name, accuses Kavanaugh of doing something, even though she cannot recall when it happened, where it happened, how it happened, and even the people that she thought or that she said were there were not there, were there, but claimed that that never happened. And in some cases, even that Kavanaugh was never even present at the event. And yet, you know, the mainstream media was really pushing this down people's throats that they had to believe her, even though nothing that she said made any sense. She has no proof, and there's actually anti-evidence against her, where what she's saying actually disproves what she's claiming. And so, you know, this really kind of broke open the real plight of men in America and also in abroad in the West, where, you know, there really is a fight or a war against masculinity. I mean, you see the Gillette ad that came out recently that received an enormous amount of backlash from the general public because people were watching this and saying, well, really what you're saying is being a man is toxic, being a man, not masculinity, where there's a certain type of masculinity that's toxic. You're saying men are toxic, and you're saying that men shouldn't exist. You know, and we see this with the pushing of single parent homes, single parent households, which is really a direct result of this kind of oppression and this feminism that's beating down men, that kind of resulted in a society that kind of says, okay, well, we don't really need men. Let's get rid of them. And things like MGTOW come out of that because men realize and increasingly begin to realize that marriage is just not a good place for them. It's not a good ideal. It's not something to work towards. It's not something that you want as a man. And reason being is that marriage has become heavily weighted in favor of the woman. And we talked about this, you know, before, that the original traditional conception of what a marriage would be is that the woman would stay home and she would, you know, caretake for the children and upkeep for the house. Well, the man went out and worked. And, you know, a survey actually just recorded another video talking about, was pointing out how, and it is funny because, you know, we're talking about a study that came out in the New York Times, one of the most liberal, feminist pushing places, you know, very liberal website, comes out and pushes this idea that, you know, it's actually conservative women in religious relationships, marriages, that are actually the most happy, who subscribe to conservative roles, conservative gender roles. And that really says a lot about our society. Those women were the happiest. There were 73% of women in that situation found themselves to be very happy. Interestingly enough, in egalitarian relationships, 69%, I believe, who were heavily feminist also had the similar outcome. Explaining the fact that there was, when you're heavily polarized to one direction or the other, you kind of have, I guess, a greater sense of happiness because there's more involvement in the home. But it really goes on to explain, how, uh, there is a lot of happiness. There is a lot of meaning to be found, in a stable, structured family. But the core tenets of that kind of society have started to kind of erode and fall away as society has pursued this kind of egalitarian lifestyle, which has just, been shown once again to not only have been perfectly viable, but in fact has actually proven to be the most meaningful and happy among Western women, at least in US adults, which is actually very fascinating to see. And we also start to see something else that was discussed was the increasing birth rates among, amongst religious individuals, that they tended to have more children, which points towards an upward trajectory of traditionalism being reintroduced into society, which I thought was actually very interesting. But so, today a lot of men are moving towards MGTOW, and the question is, well, why? And when we look at the plight of men in 2019 and beyond, and certainly for the last five and more so years, was men have kind of been sold this raw deal where now, their expected role in society is kind of facing a double-edged sword, where a man not only has to compete with and recognize the female imperative for reproduction and hypergamy, but the male also has to compete with newly created actual social constructs of egalitarianism, to the point where it espouses that a man and a woman should share an equal amount of weight in the work that they do. In other words, not only does a woman work and a man work, but they also have to split the housekeeping, house choring duties, and kind of go about things in a kind of cooperative way, as opposed to kind of having the male leadership in the household in a more conservative style, partner who raises the child, who takes care of the children. And so what we've really started to see is men move away, because when we move towards a more egalitarian system, a woman actually reproductively, when we're speaking in terms of hypergamy, when we're speaking in terms of a woman's innate desires when it comes to men, it is actually in opposition to the societal standard of what society is telling men that they must be. And so men are actually at odds, where what women want from a man has very much to do with what women are also labeling societally as misogynist. And it's that very and because it's that very misogyny that they want, men are being indoctrinated with the idea that they need to be kind of like the archetypical nice guy who kind of is very considerate and very kind of egalitarian, who doesn't kind of are particularly aggressive, because that aggressiveness and that assertiveness, which are quite masculine qualities, are seen as toxic and labeled as toxic masculinity. And so it's created a very interesting dynamic where what the women say that they want from a man and what they actually want from a man is so different from how men are being taught, that now they find themselves in a struggle also, where the court system, when the social justice system is inordinately favored in terms of a woman, also with the promulgation of the third wave feminism and the increasing kind of toxicity seen in men. And then you have that indoctrination through the movies and the TV of this archetypal male kind of, who's like more of a puppy than he is an assertive, dominant kind of character. And so really what you have from a masculine perspective is men are being told, no, you got to be nice, you got to do this, when it's the exact opposite of what a woman wants. It encourages men to be more passive and docile as a result of uh, societal encouragement. And so, really, men are kind of in this situation where no matter what they choose to do, it's a loss. You're going to lose. You're either going to lose in favor of society, you're going to lose in favor of love. And so, out of this kind of frustration comes the men's rights movement. Comes, the red pill, movies like the red pill, comes this resurgence of traditionalism, of nationalism, traditionalism, and populism, out of this idea that, where people are frustrated with, the lack of conservatism and all of the destruction that it's wrought in terms of cultural, social, and economic prosperity of the general population. It's where you have things like the yellow vest uprising, the Brexit party that's boosting right now in Britain, and you have the resurgence and the prominence of people like Donald Trump and the increasing projection that he's going to slam dunk it, because you have so much of this kind of contradictory liberalism, egalitarian centered kind of ideology, which is really masking this kind of fascist authoritarian regime that's that you start to see, or movements that you start to see with groups like Antifa, all in the name of quote unquote socialism. And it's kind of like it's a mess where you kind of have the public opinion and then you have the orchestrated kind of establishment position trying to masquerade as the general public opinion. And you're kind of starting to see the cracks there. And that's where you kind of see the increase in censorship. And then you kind of start to see the effects that it's having on men and the families and societies. And that's why we're kind of starting to see that revitalization of traditionalism. People are saying, no more, I won't have this anymore. But particularly for men, this is where the men's rights movement comes from. This is where the red pill comes from. This is where, this idea that men need to separate themselves from women comes from. Society has inherently dealt men a poor hand, and a hand that they can't just necessarily come back from. It's something that, they're kind of stuck with and they kind of have to deal with in a way. And so the question kind of becomes, well, what can men do about it? What really is there for men in a world that has kind of shunned them and turned them away? And, it's interesting. Men are in a crossroads where their rates of suicide are increasingly exploding. And it's a direct result because of the fact that in this world, it's kind of very heavy-handed towards men, harshly and in a cruel way. There is a very prominent lack of masculine figures to kind of show men the direction that they should be taking. And so that's where you kind of see the rise and the prominence, I think, of, let's say, alternative right groups, of alternative left groups, this kind of fringe activism growing out of an increasingly destabilized society. And particularly where you start to see the rise and the prominence of not alt-right, because they're not, but conservative individuals like Jordan Peterson. You start to see Ben Shapiro. You start to see there's a couple others I'm kind of blanking on right now, but the all of these types that fall under the category of the intellectual dark web, because they fall under non-establishment ideas that are non-orthodox in terms of with relation to the left. And these groups rise to prominence, and people start to listen more to Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, who are fantastic, by the way, because they kind of try to break down and bring a sense of reality to this kind of incredible westernized liberal ideology that, for example, there are over 100 different kinds of genders, or this kind of idea that everything's racist, anything and everything is racist, and that that a wall is racist or somehow immoral, as if reality has flown out the window, and there aren't scarce resources that need to be provided for people who kind of live in a home. That the idea that should even be considered is now immoral. It's an insane society. And so we have the rise and the prominence of people, particularly Jordan Peterson, who shows up to be a kind of a really a role model for men, who writes a couple of books, Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life. He's working on his third work now, which will be 12 more rules, named subject to change. And, he really gets on stage and he does a lot of lectures, and he kind of breaks down the movement that's arising out of this kind of transgender, push that's happening in so many different areas, and the need, but particularly he pushes the need for men, but individuals in general, not particularly men. It just happens that more men seem to flock to him, and for good reason. Because Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the need for meaning in one's life, or the need to take responsibility. Taking responsibility is scary, but the way for a man to find meaning in his life, in a world where a lot of men are committing suicide, where a lot of men are taking their own lives because society has really rejected them and said, in quite real terms, there's no place for men in our society anymore because masculinity is toxic. We don't need it. We need more docileness, and has continued to refuse to acknowledge this a kind of masculine essence, or a masculine desire for a purpose, for meaning. And so they flock to people like Jordan Peterson to receive that, and to kind of receive that counseling, kind of receive that in a world that's left these men behind. And so when you look at kind of the current state of men as a result of these societal changes, that's a lot of what you see, particularly in a group where it's no surprise. I just saw an article is explaining how this age group, this demographic of millennials is actually the poorest group out of any of the groups in America. The millennial generation is actually poorer than any generation that came before it. It's further behind economically than any generation that's come before it. The schools are teaching men that they need to be feminists. Men in university who try to espouse conservative ideology are considered fascist and kicked out of college campuses. Speakers are kicked out of college campuses. All of this happens in America, a country that was founded on the idea of freedom of speech, of liberty. Colleges have been co-opted by communist, socialist types who are quite forceful in their way of espousing this ideology, in a world where, again, I did a video recently talking about this rate, but that the rate of socialism, of adoption of socialism within the United States has increased. Now 4 out of 10 U.S. adults believe in socialism, or some form of socialism evolving and promulgating itself in the next 50 years, that the number of socialist countries will increase, or that most countries will become socialist. And so, we're kind of facing a society where, anybody who's really studied socialism, studied communism, they go hand in hand. And a communist socialist society has always begun with the taking of the guns, and typically followed by mass genocide. A failure of not every has followed by a mass genocide, but many have. There have been mass genocides once the guns have been taken away. There's a lot of issues inherent with a socialistic system, and particularly one in which the men are docile, because the men are the fighters. They can bring ruin, but they also create stable societies. And for society to just throw away one half of the population is a part of the problem that we're talking about here today. So, I caution against it, and to look at men and to say, no, you have a place here is what we need more of. And so, this video is made in part to those men to kind of, espouse the idea that men are not alone. And there's a place for men. And in fact, you've existed in a society that has left you behind. But that's not something for you to take up as in a victimhood status, as a lot of the left would like you to take, so that you can become kind of pawns to a greater government where you need more handouts, you need more help, you need more things, and so that you never become independent. And don't be, misled. That is a real evil. There's a real evil in never allowing a person to become self-sufficient, to become responsible for their own lives, to be able to take their lives in whatever direction that they deem necessary or that they would like to travel down. When your life is built on dependence, you have no real sense of freedom, no real sense of travel, no real sense of ability, because quite by the definition of it alone, you are not able to. And so you see the growth of things like what just recently is starting to be utilized in high schools around the country, this idea of an adversity score that's completely non-transparent. And so if you're a high schooler, based on your race, based on your background, you're actually handicapped in terms of your SAT score. In other words, you can get a boost of, say, 200 or 300 points just by being black, for example. And so really what it's trying to say is that, if you're black, you need help. It's inherently a racist system. But not only that, it kind of it's pushing people into universities where they may not be able to perform to the level that they need to graduate. And it's pushing people into situations where they become more dependent on the state, where the state is becoming inherently racist in its decisions to quote unquote promote diversity and promote inclusion, has really done a war against the issue with socialism is it's a war against achievement. It tries to equalize for society by removing any incentive for innovation, any incentive for achievement, in the hope that everybody will stay destitute and poor at the lowest levels of any society or any group. And that's what we're kind of starting to see, where, if you're black but you didn't work as hard or study as hard by chance, then we're going to give you 300 points so that you can match this Asian kid who stayed up every night in school, who worked so hard and worked his butt off. It's actually a decentive. It's a work to decentivize those who can achieve more from doing so. It's also the same thing you see where they want to push kind of an equalized wage, so that people who train 13 years, 20 years to be a doctor of any sort of field can earn just as much as someone who trained 2 weeks to work at a McDonald's. This kind of equality of outcome that's completely independent from any amount of work, or any amount of innovation, or any amount of study that someone does to better their own lives, to kind of say that, your 20 years of medical training is worth just as much as Joe Schmo who's 13, who works at McDonald's, who's just been there for 3 months. You can't make more than him. It's quite the system, and don't get me wrong, it will suppress people down and decrease. Socialism is never a good route. It's never been a good route. The people who propose socialism have never actually seen it happen. Anybody who's ever been in a socialistic country, who's come to America, knows its evils and pushes it away, and forcefully so, and rightly so, because they realize the dangers inherent with the socialistic society. Socialism is espoused by people who are ignorant of the realities of socialism. It's never been a good thing. And most people who espouse socialism are people who don't have jobs, who don't own houses, who haven't actually paid bills. And it's not usually until they reach that point that they don't become the liberal socialist types that they've been. And that's because they start to realize that, well, actually, these policies have a real influence on my life. People start to realize that a universal minimum wage actually means that their income taxes are going to go up by 15, 20, 25, 30%. And then once their wages are at about half or more of their actual income, then they start to say, hey, well, where did all my money go? And the equalization happens not by bringing other people up so that everybody makes an actual livable wage, but rather by pulling everyone else's down so that the quality of life for everyone across the board is greatly diminished. Anybody who studied a socialistic society would see that that's the case, and that always happens. That's not a sometimes happens thing, because you have to take into account human nature and the fact that human nature has never changed since the beginning of time, since Adam and Eve. And so, it's that society has become this kind of breeding ground for socialists. It's become a breeding ground. And I'll tell you right now, as I told a friend way back when, socialism is just a flip of a switch, a very easy switch to flip to right into communism. It's not, it is very easy to fall from a socialistic society into a communistic society. And so, sitting here and talking about it and talking about men, men have been dealt a bad hand, and men are in a situation where, unfortunately, and I've thought about this myself, marriage is not the best place for men. Objectively so. It's not. It's really not, because men have a lot to lose by being in marital relationships right now. And as destructive or bad as that may seem or sound, that's the objective reality of it. That's not to say that men should not be in relationships or get into relationships. Men just need to be cognizant of what they're getting themselves into. I am by no means discouraging men from getting into relationships. I think relationships are great, but I at this point in time, looking at the risks of men, to men in relationships today, considering hypergamy, considering societal standards, and the realities of male-female dynamics, I can't justifiably say that the best place for a man is in a relationship. And that's just the reality. That's the reality designed by the powers that be, by the establishment, by pushing these kinds of cultural norms onto groups of society. But I'd also like to say, and we're kind of running a little bit long here, so we'll pick this up and cover this more in detail in the next episode. But there's a real place in society today for men, particularly, to kind of reassert themselves into society, to kind of disregard these claims of, say, toxic masculinity, and kind of put themselves back on the pedestal. In other words, for men to return to being men. And there's a real call for that and a real need for that, assuming men are willing and able to take responsibility back for their own lives. There's a real place for men in society, but not only a place, there's a real desperate need for men in society, one that really needs to be answered, that shouldn't be kind of disregarded as something that really doesn't matter, because it does. Society needs more men, not fewer. Society needs more active men. Families need more men. But it's not going to just start with more men becoming involved in society. It's going to start by society also starting to accept men. And clearly what we see from the media is that that's not going to be the place at which it happens. In a lot of different ways, the media has become anti-male. We need men themselves to step up and say, I'm going to get more involved in my society, but also the men and women of society to embrace them and take them in, and to reject the anti-male movement that's happening within the United States, because a lot of people will, for example, say that no, feminism is about equality. Well, when you look at the actions and the consequences in today's real world of the real consequences of third wave feminism, the exact opposite of what is what is actually happening. Do not look at what someone says. Look at their actions. As we learn in our Bibles, you'll know a man by his fruits. By you'll know a tree by the fruit that it bears. And a lot of what it bears is destruction, and it's not good. It's not good. So, to being a man today is difficult. Being in the same millennial generation has been very kind of a different, a very different era from anyone that has come before, and in its own ways very challenging, and in its own ways very easy. But no matter what way you look at it, society will not be able to function without a strong male class. When the men are weak, societies fall. They really do. And so there's a real call in men. There's a real need for you in society. And so, that's really kind of all we'll probably get to today. So with that, guys, if you guys like the video, be sure to smash that subscribe button. If you love the video, definitely smash that subscribe button. But be sure to also hit that like button and hit the bell icon so that you're notified the next time we make a video that goes live. But also be sure to leave a comment. Anything that you do, really anything, really helps out the channel, because it goes into that, it feeds into that YouTube algorithm that kind of tells YouTube, okay, well, this video has a lot of engagement. Let's give it more traction. Let's put it in more people's feeds. And it certainly helps, as we're facing increased censorship of people who don't share left-wing ideology. It's funny because they fight fascism, but really their actions are the fascist actions out of anyone. So really anything you guys can do would help. Feel free to give me your feedback and your ideas and what you guys all think about what we're talking about here today. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Take it easy. Peace.